Welcome to Chemistry 100. This is Cerritos College's Chemistry for Allied Health, also known as General, Organic, and Biochemistry. We're going to start with Unit 1, which is very basic concepts of chemistry. And the first thing we're going to start with is the element symbols. Most of you have heard of what the elements are and may have some idea of what some of the symbols are. We have a list of 32 elements and their symbols that you will be memorizing for the Unit 1 exam and for the first quiz that you'll have in lab. As a side note, I wanted to tell you that when I took this class many years ago, this was our first quiz, very similar to this at a different college, and when I took it, I failed it miserably. The reason I failed is I didn't listen to the instructor and thought I had to know all of the elements and symbols. I thought I had to know where they were on the periodic table and all sorts of different information. Please listen carefully to what you need to know. Now, let's get started. This is a list of the common elements that we will be using throughout this class this semester. One of the first quizzes that you'll have in lab will include these symbols and the names. You will be expected to know how to write the name correctly and how to write the symbol correctly. But please note, there's very specific details here. You do not need to know where they're at in the periodic table. You don't have to know any of the numbers associated with it at this point. None of those things are going to be memorized. At this point, you just need to know how to write the name correctly, how to write the symbol correctly, and that those two go together. So before we start working on the memorization of these elements, what we need to remember are two major things: spelling counts and capitalization matters. These two things are very, very important for our writing of the chemical symbols and names. So the symbol is a two-letter way of identifying which element we're talking about. The name is the much longer version of it. When we write the name, we have to be very careful about how it's spelled and its capitalization. Because these are not people, we don't capitalize the names of these. They may be capitalized if they're at the start of a sentence, but otherwise it should be all lowercase. Then when we look at the symbol, it's much more important. What we're going to really focus on in the symbols is how we write each symbol. So we need to have a uppercase. If there's only one letter, it's all uppercase. If there's two letters, it's going to have uppercase and then lowercase. So you have to be super careful about how you write them. So for example, we have M with a lowercase g, not M with a capital G. That one's not as vital as the next one. If we look at CO, capital C, lowercase o, that is a beautiful blue rock called cobalt. And CO, capital C, capital O, is going to be carbon monoxide, a deadly, colorless, clear gas. So those are completely different things. We want to be very careful to make sure that we know which one we're writing. So usually this error comes from writing in handwriting or print rather than when we're typing it. So when we're typing it, it's not usually a big problem. But let me give you an example of what we see for errors. So we have chlorine, for instance. We have capital C lowercase l versus capital C uppercase L. And let me ask you, which one is this? Well, because of this little loop at the end, we're going to say that this is a capital C, capital L. Be very careful about how you write your letters. The L in particular, a lot of people like to put a little loop on it, and that makes it into a capital L. What about this one? We're going to try CR. What do you think of this? Capital or lower? Is this a correct symbol? Well, it's got a large C and a small r, but that is not a lowercase r. So that is a problem. Again, we have to be very careful to make sure that it looks like the correct lowercase form. So capital C lowercase r is what we should have. Well, how about this one? So we have Al, which is aluminum. We have a large A and a smaller L. Is that correct? Well, hopefully you can see that that is a very large lowercase a with a lowercase l. What about this one? So we have an F for fluorine. Is that an uppercase or a lowercase? Well, because of the curvature here, that appears to be a lowercase f. So again, that would be wrong. We have to make sure that we have a very solidly formed, squared off letter F to make it into a capital F. Let's do one last one. We're going to look at that cobalt versus carbon monoxide. Just as a handwriting thing, you're going to see large letter C and small letter O. Can you tell if it's a capital or lower? Not really by their form, but you can certainly see it because they're next to each other. Here would be a capital C with a capital O where they're the same size. Even if they're either both large or both small, you can still see that they are the same size. Versus this with a capital C lower O, where you can see that they are two different sizes in the same symbol. Now let's look at what you have to memorize. So let's look at many of these individually. This list has 32 elements that are very, very common. They're the ones that we'll be using throughout the course, and they are the things that are the most common on Earth also. We're going to start by looking at 9 elements that have only one symbol that represent them. These ones were some of the first ones discovered, and so they ended up with just one symbol. When they realized that there are far more than 26 of them, they expanded on this and they made it with a 2-letter symbol. So we start by looking at carbon, fluorine, hydrogen, iodine, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, potassium, and sulfur. Each of those have one letter only, and it will be a capital letter. Just focusing on those, I want to just talk about them a little bit more. Specifically fluorine. The reason I like to talk about this one in particular is because of its spelling. Notice that the spelling is Fluorine. A lot of people like to put the other direction on the U and the O, and so I want to make sure that you focus on that so that when you're spelling it, you get it correctly. And then the other one that to notice is phosphorus. So what's interesting about phosphorus is that in some countries they spell it a different way. I'm not going to mention the other way of spelling it because I don't want to confuse you, but notice that the end of this ends with a US, because in the US we spell it with a US at the end. And then unusual thing is potassium. It is potassium, but it starts with a K, and that's because its Latin name is kalium. And so we got the letter K from that. And finally, we have sulfur, and what's interesting about that is to notice how to spell it. In some countries, they spell it slightly differently, and sometimes people think it sounds different, so they like to spell it differently. So just make sure you know how to spell sulfur. Sulfur. So it's like furry. Okay? Now, we're going to look at the ones that sort of make sense. It's the first letter, as we expect from the name, and then it's the second letter or third letter of the name, and they make some kind of sense. A lot of people get these ones right. So we have aluminum, barium, bromine, calcium, cesium. Again, it's the third letter, so that one makes some sense. Cobalt. Let me jump over to the next column. We see lithium, magnesium. Again, it's the third letter, but it makes some sense. Nickel, rubidium, again the third letter, silicon, strontium, and that one's pretty good, and then zinc. Amongst these easier ones, we do see a few minor errors with spelling, so I'm just going to highlight those. The first one would be aluminum. I often see aluminum. For some reason, people like to make it a minimum, I guess. The next one that I see that is a common error in spelling is nickel. So that should always end with an EL. A lot of people like to spell it like a penny, nickel, dime, quarter, that type of nickel. But this one ends up with an EL, not an LE. And the last one that is often spelled wrong in this grouping is silicon. Notice that this is silicon, not silicone. So there's no E at the end of this. We're not looking at breast implants, so we're just looking at silicon. Now let's focus on the ones that don't make as much sense. So we'll start with antimony. Antimony has the abbreviation SB. It comes from its previous name, which was stibium, and so we've stuck with that. The best thing I can do for you is to give you kind of a memory tool that helps you remember which one is which. This is just a tool. I'm going to use several of these for the rest of the ones that have difficult names and initials. So let's go with antimony. Here's how I remember it. That son of a didn't pay his antimony. Obviously, that's not quite right, but it gives you some idea of how to remember it. And the next one is chlorine. Now, I kept this one separate, even though, according to our previous definition, it could be the first letter and then this third letter. The reason I kept this one separate is because a lot of people spell this one incorrectly. Chlorine, the spelling, has an H in it, and a lot of people forget that H because they see the abbreviation Cl. So beware that there is a CHLORINE. Our next one is copper, and again, I do kind of a little joke to help myself remember it, and I'm going to make it a joke about a ring. A lot of them are going to be using this ring as a memory tool. So we're going to use copper first. Copper is a fairly inexpensive metal, so if somebody gives you a copper ring, you'd say, see you later, don't want that. The reason we have CU is because the Latin term for copper was cyprium, because copper was mined in Cyprus originally. The next one, if your partner gives you a gold ring, you would say, AU, I like that one. Notice that AU stands for aurum, the original Latin name for gold. Again, Latin terminology that's been brought forward to use in its symbol. The next one is iron. If they give you an iron ring, you go, Feh, don't like that. And Fe stands for ferrum, again, a Latin term. And next we have lead. Lead is Latin term was plumbum. It was used for plumbing, so you notice that the spelling is a little bit weird. Plumbing and plumbers used a lot of lead back in the olden days, and so it was called plumbum. It's now called lead, but the abbreviation is PB. And next we have mercury. Mercury has abbreviation Hg for hydrogyrus, which means liquid silver, and this is our liquid element. But one of the ways I remember it is I remember Mercury, he's a god, so Hg is he's a god. Just my memory tool. Next we have silver. If somebody gives you a silver ring, you go, ag, that's going to turn my skin black, because a lot of people react to silver and it turns things black quite often. So we'll go ahead and say that. And that abbreviation is for the Latin term argentum, which is what the silver element used to be called. Next we have sodium, and it has the abbreviation Na, and what we mean by that is natrium is where the original came from. Again, a Latin term. If somebody gave me a sodium ring, I would say, nah, that's going to burn my hand. Can't have that one. And our last one is tin. So tin has the abbreviation Sn, and it comes from the Latin term stannum, which is its original name. If somebody gave you a ring that was made of tin, you would say, that's a sin, because tin is a sin. And that's how I remember Sn goes with tin.